Alrighty, hello every folks, and good morning. Welcome to a quick discussion here on Tactics Ogre 1 Vision's version of stats, classes, level ups, all of that kind of stuff. Effectively, if it's got a meter, if it's got experience, that's what we're going to be discussing here today. Essentially, more effective training methods, how you should be setting people up, when you should really care about grinding, and all of that kind of stuff, as well as the effects of levels on your day-to-day everything. So, let's go ahead and establish something right off the bat. You know how for months I kept saying, hey, look, here's Tactics Ogre Reborn. It's essentially bringing in a lot of the same systems from Tactics Ogre PSP, but the context is very different. And that's the important part. Well, here's Tactics Ogre 1 Vision. It's bringing in a lot of the same mechanics on paper from Tactics Ogre PSP, but the context is very different. So let's go ahead and get into that. First and foremost, let's talk about the segregated classes and people. So, the thing about the PSP system, and it's a system that was taken out and reborn because it's kind of weird, but One Vision does different stuff with it. The thing with this system is that, again, it's used in different contexts in every situation. If we're looking over at Reborn, a unit levels up as a class, they only had that one level up, so they just get the bonuses from that class, and they only have a certain amount of levels that they can level up in. Classic RPG kind of stuff. Same thing back back in the SNES version. But then when we get to the PSP version, they did something weird, in which they said, hey, you can just kind of re-level somebody as any class whenever you like, but it's a one-time bonus. So the class itself is the thing that gives a one-time bonus, which means that if you, for example, lose a character, you permanently lose those level up bonuses for that character, leading to this weird fear of missing out that ends up happening if you, let's say, lose characters. Or, for example, this feeling that your rookies just can't seem to catch up, and you don't really understand why. They've got the same levels, they've got the same gear. What exactly is going on? Well, their stats. Let's say that other guy leveled up as a cleric 17 times in a row, and then switched over to archer. And even though that cleric was a mind specialist, you know, they still ended up getting stat bonuses across the board that still it gave them a little bit of a noticeable bonus. So in One Vision, it basically says, okay, screw that. That system is super cheesable. It constantly gives you that kind of gross feeling of like, oh shoot, I did my levels wrong, and now this is just wasted effort. Now it feels like there's just going to be this cloud hanging over my save file forever. So instead, your level ups are just class level ups. They just go up. It doesn't matter. You're not missing out on anything by going and leveling up your class, right? Basically, the immediate example that comes to mind is Valkyria Chronicles there. Just like you're leveling up your class, all of those of that class are just now better. So the class and the person are entirely segregated in this version. Meaning that there is no downside to leveling up a particular class. There is no level up bonus given to the character for being a particular class. The class is essentially the suit of pants that they put on that day, whereas, you know, another day they might switch to another class, but the person is still the same person that they always were. So, for example, if you look over at your character sheet over here on the bottom left, now that we have a mouse and gamepad in the same place, on the left is going to be their personal stats, on the right is going to be their derived stats. So this is what happens when the class is slapped onto the person. Now, when it comes to actually moving your stats, this is something that you'll typically do from two sources. Either the cards that you pick up on the ground, which are a decent bit more rare in One Vision, or food items, which are crazy expensive. So for the most part, your stats will largely stay more or less the same for most of your team. In most situations, you're going to want a wide variety of different types of units, and so you really don't need to be worrying about power leveling one particular unit's stats. Realistically, most of your growth in this game comes from the kind of interesting creations that you put together on the equipment screen and how they synergize with their skills. The stats help, but you need a lot of stats to overcome any of the rest of it. So don't stress about stats. It's nice if you have extra. If you find a card that matches their build, wonderful, great. But again, it would take like 15 cards or something to go match a piece of equipment. So don't sit there going and grinding it all out. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on here. So that's the first aspect of your characters here, the person themselves. The second aspect is going to be the class that slaps on top of it. And within that class, you've got the stats, obviously, but you've also got an attack and defense modifier over here. And this will essentially give you a little bit of preference whenever going and attacking. Think of it as just basically being slapped on top of your weapon attack, right? So a class that's more offense-orientated would be, a bit better at hitting stuff. Or let's say something that's a bit more defensively orientated might be a bit better at protecting themselves. And so to that end, some of these might seem a little bit odd, like the Cleric, which, in their particular case, they have relatively weak weapons, but this does give them a decent amount of punch in some situations. But just understand that those are going to be a part of it. They're not the main thing that you're going for all the time, but they are a thing that's going to be there. Anyway, that being said, the third and fourth and most important pillars of your characters are going to be their equipment as well as their skills. So like, let's say you have this guy over here, so I'm assuming most of y'all are very familiar with the equipment stuff at this point if you are looking at a video like this. But your equipment is obviously going to be all over the dang place. The builds in One Vision can get extremely wacky, but that's usually going to determine the sort of initial performance of your character. So like this guy's got his main Ghost, he's got his Phantom Cloak, he's going to be crazy evasive. The amount of agility that it would take to overcome that evasion is phenomenal, so he doesn't really necessarily have to worry about anything touching him. From there, we have our skills, and this is where stuff gets a little bit different. So, when it comes to these skills, there are going to be similar skills to PSP, but this is, again, another system that's kind of been improved from the inside out. So, let's say we look over here at this Juggernaut, right? You'll notice he's able to have Anatomy, and he's ranking it up reasonably quick. So, the racial skill is, I assume most folks are familiar with how weapon skills work. Those are pretty obvious. Like, you rank those up, you use the weapon, you get finishers, right? The racial skills are a bit different, especially if you're coming from Reborn, and the racial skills are essentially a second stack of your weapon skill, but it only applies versus that particular racial type. And additionally, there's another rule that's in there that units cannot equip the same racial type as themselves. This is due to a weird way that you could cheese this stuff in PSP, since these skills apply both offensively and defensively. So like Anatomy will give you some offense bonus versus this unit, but it also, for example, would give 12 armor versus it, because it's going to be 4 extra armor per rank, as well as 4 extra attack, I think it was. It was either 4 or 6. One of those. Anyway, point is, it gives you extra armor, it gives you extra penetration, more or less. But you can't equip your own thing. So in this particular instance, he is better defended against people, he is better at damaging people, but if, for example, he was a person, he would basically just always get that bonus before. That's why there's that rule in place that they can't equip their own racial type. Because it basically would say, hey, hold on, I'm checking if there's a person involved in this equation. Wait a minute, there's a person, it's the person defending. They've got, like, they understand their kneecaps so well they can't break, you know? So anyway, let's go ahead and carry on here. The main thing that you're probably interested in is how exactly do you rank these up? How exactly do you more efficiently rank up your skills? And for that matter, how do you, let's say, rank up your augments? Because that can also be a little bit of a funny duck to do. So, when it comes to these ranks, essentially anytime they are checked for the purposes of damage, they will be ranked up. And yeah, there are skills like parry that don't technically do damage. We'll get to that in a sec. Point is, in most situations, like for example your weapon ranks and your augments, they have to do damage in order to rank up. So like a debuff will not give them any additional experience. The experience that it gives seems to be a sort of random roll of under 1% per each interaction, with the only difference basically just being how many times it was checked during that particular interaction. So, for example, doing additional damage doesn't give you additional experience or anything like that. Just to debunk that one before we get there, that was an old one that was flying around for ages. Just sometimes you do more, sometimes you do less, okay? It is a little bit random in terms of how much experience it'll give you. Additionally, though, you can, for example, power level your units by causing it to be checked more often. So, like, let's say this Caldia over here is classed as a dagger, and let's say we had her go meet up with this Patriarch over here, and we had them go take a swing at each other with each other's daggers, and they both countered each other. They're essentially taking a swing with a dagger, and being hit by a dagger also trains up daggers, because it's a dagger interaction. There is damage ready to be exchanged, there's a dagger involved, it's ready and willing to give you some experience. And then you counter, and then you essentially get the same experience going the other way as well. So you do get a little bit less when you're defending against a weapon or element or anything like that, but it does give you some additional experience in that regard. Same thing for using finishers. If you go over to your finishers, and let's say she was a wind element over here, if she were to use this Heartbreaker over here, it would train her wind a little bit here. Okay. That also said, there's actually one more thing to mention here, which is when it comes to instills and resonances. So resonance and instill both basically does the same thing. It puts the instill buff onto somebody. Now, if somebody's instilled with a particular element, they also will train with that element. And bear in mind, it will also train all available elements at the same time. So, like, let's say you had a fire sword and you were instilled with air, and you had augments for both. You would train the sword skill, you would train the fire skill, you would train the air skill. Okay, so all of them are being checked at the same time. So yeah, you just basically repeat those ad nauseum. Additionally, it's worth noting that the experience rates for all of these different skills are different in One Vision, and essentially mean that, for example, let's say we go over to something extremely rare, like let's say divine units, you are pretty much never going to be fighting angels, meaning you're probably getting like 5 or 6% experience every time you go and take a swing at an angel, whereas stuff like dragons and beasts and humans, you're fighting all the dang time, so you're probably getting less than 1% whenever they're being trained up here. So the rarer a skill is, the faster it trains up. Just kind of be aware of that there. And additionally, it's worth noting that when it comes to your ranks, there are going to be pieces of equipment that will also give you a bonus. So for example, in this case, this light helmet over here is going to be a type of equipment category that gives you a bonus to parry. And in this particular instance, he's already equipping parry, so this means that the parry odds in this one, which are roughly like 5% per rank, would go up to 25% rather than 20%. So effectively, his helmet is helping him to deflect stuff away. It's worth noting that if you do have equipment that has a skill bonus, you have to equip the skill in order for it to count. If you do not have the skill, it doesn't have anything to apply it to. It does need to marry something in your skill list in order to have any effect. Okay? Alright, so next up, let's go ahead and talk about just kind of efficient-ish leveling and whatever else. So going back to the classes real quick, you'll note that there's going to be those cases when you get a new person in your class and like, shoot, I don't want to raise up this new rookie. You know, I don't want to deal with having this new dead weight on my team, and you might be tempted to say, wait, you know, I don't feel like bothering getting this new person up. So what you want to do in this particular instance is essentially go and take everybody else on your team, whatever they happen to be, and make sure that they're the same level, okay? You then take your one rookie and you throw them in the back. So in this case, I have a fresh new Lich that I picked up on this particular save, and we'll throw her back there. I should point out that what we're going to be discussing here is essentially how experience is doled out at the end of the fight. So here's the thing. This is another one of those differences between PSP and One Vision. For most people, and by most people I mean like everyone except for somebody that stubbornly refuses to use this, if you have the means to, like I assume most people are emulating, most people are going to be using PPSSPP, go to your cheat database, you basically go into your settings, you enable cheats, and then you open up your cheat database file for Tactics Ogre. You go over here, you get the class EXP scaling fix, it's from the same website as One Vision. It's one of the ones that's considered mandatory. There's essentially 2 cheats that are considered mandatory for One Vision. There's a hell of a lot of stuff that you can tweak to change the game to your liking, but the low-level class EXP scaling fix is one of those. The other one is to have enemy pickups go to you like they do in Reborn. Now, the reason that this is important is because it basically nullifies the main downside of this original system, which is raising up the newbies. It's something that that couldn't really be avoided just due to the fact that it was already kind of baked into the system. And so many people were averse to this kind of system that it was just straight up removed for Reborn. Now, there are benefits to this, though, because it basically means that your party can remain at sort of... You gain the benefit of the level cap system from Reborn, but you kind of decide what your own level cap is, that your party just sort of averages out about where it needs to be. So, a quick note on levels real quick. So when you get a new class, it's going to be at 1, okay? Typically, the first fight that you put them into, even if you're not using the class EXP scaling fix, they typically will go up by like 5 levels, then by 4 levels, then by 3 levels, etc. They will get the lion's share of that experience. What what the class EXP scaling fix does is it intensifies that effect, so that they end up getting pretty much all of the experience. So if you have a low level class, they go up like 10 levels at once, meaning that you can just basically throw them into a couple of training fights and you're done. They're caught up to everybody else, more or less. So we'll go ahead and get this fight started here just to show this off, but just so you know, that's one of the reasons why that code is in there. Even though it's technically applied to the game as a cheat, its main benefit is for the purpose of quality of life here. Sorry about that. For some reason the sound decided to go funky and it needed fixing, so it has now been fixed. Anyway, so the benefit of this system is effectively the same as the level cap system in Reborn, but it doesn't have that same feeling of being a kind of arbitrary wall, as it were. Now, personally, due to the way that this game is paced out, I personally really liked that system in Reborn, but this effectively gives you a sort of alternate version of the same thing, in which whenever you're going and using classes that you like, they will, generally speaking, average out amongst themselves to the point that you're never overpowered or underpowered. You're just essentially growing as a team, you're going and unlocking new features for your team as you carry along, but there really isn't a point at which, you know, it suddenly is taking you out of the experience in order to let you know, hey, guess what, it's experience time. So, for example, even if you were to go and grind to an excessive degree in One Vision, if you're not paying attention to your tactics and mechanics, you're gonna have a bad time anyway. Simply put, it's just not the kind of thing that you'll be able to go and dead brain through. Anyway, so that being said, let's go ahead and talk about classes here real quick. So normally when you get a new class, they will pretty much always start at 1. There's a handful of exceptions, like for example the Paladin, that'll typically show up at 4. It's really such an edge case that it doesn't really matter. But anyway, the idea here is that you throw them in the back of your team, you go do a fight with a bunch of units that are of the same level, and it'll put you in a position here where they can be leveled up very, very quickly. Usually it's easiest to do this with one class at a time, as it'll just allow you to go get them up to scratch as quickly as possible. Pretty much around the point that they end up getting to, let's say, about 10 to 15 or so. I mean, it depends on the kind of class, of course, but typically around that point is when you'll start noticing that they can really hold their own without necessarily needing those extra, like, 10 or so levels. Like, they will be clearly weaker than everybody else. But generally speaking, there's that initial weakness period the characters have, and usually stuff averages out quite a bit once they reach the double digits, because that's when they start getting additional pieces of equipment. That's when we start seeing that they're going to be using all kinds of different weapon categories, and that's when they can really actually properly suit up into a build of some variety. You know, properly be able to, let's say, put on some heavy armor or have some deflection set up or something like that. So they will at least be able to contribute, and usually they'll end up averaging out their level pretty quickly. It gives them a very sort of organic feeling growth when you're going through the game. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, that realistically you only need a small handful of fights in order to get something done here. So typically the area that's recommended for this is going to be Tynemouth Hill. It's a very simple map to get to. You have access to it almost all of the time. The units here are going to be fairly weak when they're going and spawning in, and yeah, in general, it's just going to be an easy place to get to. You only have a handful of enemies here, and again, they are very easy to deal with. So you know, you have that available for you there. Let's go ahead and tabula rasa denim back into the party here as you do. So, you optionally can go into Farampa Wildwood, though it is worth noting that Farampa is a decent bit more deadly if you're playing One Vision for the first time. It does have way better rewards, but that place, it's definitely the proper wilderness. There's definitely more spooky stuff going on in there than you might be used to. So, usually going and, let's say going... oh wow, those odds kind of suck, huh? Usually going for a Tynemouth or the river nearby here is going to be the easiest way to handle things. So, alright, next thing I want to mention here is that you can actually technically passively train things if you're... Like, if for some reason you're doing a challenge run that requires that, there are going to be a lot of cases where you'll start noticing that there's certain elements or patterns or whatever else that show up on these random maps. And so if, for example, you wanted to train up, let's say, fire a little bit faster, you just go find like-minded wizards and get hit by fireballs while throwing fireballs at them, and you'll find that your ranks go up a lot faster. Now, I want to set some realistic expectations here. This is not the PSP version, obviously, but I want to be very clear that just going and getting yourself to max ranks, it'll be beneficial, but that by itself does not a broken unit make, alright? It's going to take a decent bit to give yourself a broken unit. Usually, they'll end up being far more competent, like, for example, your ranged units will end up having a lot more accuracy, your melee units will be able to hit noticeably harder, but don't kind of, I guess you could say, gaslight yourself into thinking that you're just going to instantly curb stomp everything. Like, maybe for here, but once you get into the harder areas, once you start getting into, you know, even later for Rampa, or even later in the story, just expect that there will be a decent fight coming from the enemy team there, okay? So, okay, next up on this thing, as far as those class levels go. So, the main thing that you'll start noticing that you're getting as a benefit from your levels is actually going to not be their stats, but their equipment. And that's actually the next thing. You don't necessarily want to over-level to the point that you're scaling up the game kind of against yourself, because you'll notice as you carry on, you know, you will still get to the point that characters will be carrying around equipment that might be better than yours. So, like, by this point, when we're past about the level 20 mark here, they're already carrying around elemental equipment. In some cases, they're going to be equipping augments. In cases like Tynemouth Hill, again, it's pretty safe. The builds are not terribly optimized, but the heavier you get into the game, that's when you'll notice that Rakes has actually put together some pretty devious teams. So expect that there's going to be harder teams to fight every now and then. So the harder areas you go to, it's not just stats. A lot of times it's just that their builds are way better. Also, I don't know why I'm attacking my own guy there. That wasn't the smartest thing in the world. So just expect that that can be a thing as well. Also, one more thing I want to point out here that I actually probably could have pointed out with that soldier over there. In fact, actually, maybe we'll... no, we've got our belt coming up. We'll use her. So one thing that is worth pointing out is that there's actually skills that can rank up in PSP and One Vision that you actually can't rank in Reborn. So for example, things like combining together Anatomy and Recruit is actually really beneficial. You will be able to give yourself a kind of bonus to your recruit ability, and additionally, the recruit ability itself can be ranked up. So, for example, in this case, she's at 31%. She's ranked it up a couple of times because it's a very useful skill. But let's say we had that same ability over on the Patriarch over here, which I don't currently, and he had Recruit. He would be able to stack Anatomy to effectively double the effectiveness of something like Recruit. So okay, that's a use case for that there. But one thing I also want to point out is that you can actually talk to your own people to rank up Recruit as well. If a skill is applicable, if it's something that could work, it will try. So like, let's say Recruit, technically it's just for use on people, right? And so let's say you have this Valkyrie, they've got nothing better to do. As you can see, 5 experience over here. We can go ahead and attempt to recruit our own unit over here. And even though it will miss, it was still a valid unit, so it will still have ranked up 2.5%. Instead, we're going to go ahead and go for this one, but just so you're aware, you can actually train up your recruit skills without necessarily going and putting them in harm's way. And this is really useful because those recruit skills, especially at longer ranges, become absolutely crucial. Subduing and recruiting enemies will help you out so much. Like, I know I said that a lot for Reborn, but especially true here. Alright, so here's where we are. Actually, I just noticed I kind of screwed myself here by recruiting that archer. Okay, so about that Lich was supposed to go up to about 8 or 9 there from that fight. You might notice on the stat screen right here what I screwed up, because I recruited an archer who's at 26, which counts as the highest unit, which means that there is a kind of tiered out lower award for the second place one there, which gave a bunch of 94s that would have been 15s to the rest of the team, and then still gave the lion's share at 227 to the Lich. So we'll go ahead and run another example fight there real quick. Do you want to recruit them? No. But we will take all their stuff. So we'll tell them to piss off. We'll take that fire crossbow, and we'll go ahead and move on. Anyway, so yeah, don't do what I did for that one. Tends not to make for a very good example when the example doesn't work. But yeah, most of that experience, she should have gotten about triple what she actually did there. But yeah, you want to go ahead and put them all as the same number. So this is kind of contrary to how it was back in PSP. And just for the sake of context, since obviously a lot of those videos are a decent bit older at this point, the way that it worked in PSP is that you would go and switch everybody to one particular class, and then essentially it would multiply that experience based off how many members of that class were there. And so on paper, this was supposed to be like, hey, look, you know, you're getting rewarded for having additional units. In reality, what it created was a situation that your party would forever be at uneven levels because your favorite units got over-leveled because you might have had more than one. So it led to some unfortunate situations where you had to stop using your favorite units because, you know, suddenly they were eating up everyone's experience because there were more of them. It just, man. Again, the reason that One Vision and Reborn both exist is because, you know, PSP had great ideas and then implemented them poorly. Okay, so we'll go ahead and repeat a similar situation to what we did before. We'll have our Valkyrie over here throwing around her grenades. I probably should be using a bit more poison just for expediency's sake. And we'll go ahead and put her on fast forward a little bit so that we can go ahead and get this fight over with a little faster here. Okay. So, as far as other training methods are concerned, a few other little kind of just random notes to throw out there. As far as your weapons go, it's similar to how this worked for the previous example. The less common a weapon is, the faster they'll end up training up with it. Funnily enough, this actually was something that existed in PSP as well, but only for one weapon category, where you would train up fusils a lot faster than anything else, but then for stuff like instruments that you actually ended up getting later, they just decided not to. So, you know, again, kind of one of those it is what it is type of situations. But in this particular case, yeah, you have you've got all of your different categories essentially being tiered out depending on how likely you are to be using them, how difficult they might be to obtain, etc. So either way, that ends up working nicely. Overall, you can probably, if you've played One Vision before, you can probably attest to how cozy it feels. But anyway, let me just go ahead and skip to when we get to the experience here. One more thing I want to point out here real quick. It's kind of half relevant to this because all of your ranks will affect your accuracy as well. But just to kind of throw this out there, if you are finding yourself in a position that you maybe have some issues landing a hit with any of your attacks, remember that stuff like back attack, aka trajectory over here, does actually affect all types of attacks. It's one of the few abilities that'll do that. So basically anything from weapon hits to special skills, weapon skills, finishers, you know, unique finishers, pretty much anything without a locked-in percentage, I believe including a lot of types of spells and such. This will actually benefit your accuracy by up to 25%. So just kind of bear that in mind, that sometimes it might be tempting to go and just grind out those weapon ranks or augment ranks for accuracy, but instead, you can always go for trajectory here. Actually, speaking of accuracy, it's worth noting, stuff like Spell Strike will improve your spell accuracy, your augment ranks will not improve your debuff accuracy, since they're apparently classed as some type of secondary effect rather than a primary attack, and it's anything that's counted as a primary attack that your facing or accuracy will affect. Anyway, moving on. Okay, one more detail that I want to throw out there. When it comes to recruits part that it plays in all of this, bear in mind that any recruited units will have their... essentially, they will be counted as if they were in your party the whole time. So while technically there is a mechanic where the experience and skill points and stuff like that will slightly skew towards people that did more during the fight, it is such a minor mechanic that there is 100% no reason to mention it other than somebody will definitely mention it. So I'm just kind of throwing it out there. You will never use that. But when it comes to recruiting units to be on your side, if, for example, you see that there's a bunch of units that you already use, you can amplify the experience that you are dumping into your lower-end units by going and essentially recruiting more units of your same type into your team. Since, again, the more units you have of a particular type, the more it's amplifying experience. So technically, if you wanted to get hyper efficient with it, you could, for example, go put like 6 spell blades and then give them recruit, and then you have your 1 extra unit, and then you just have them throw a bunch of grenades to just poison and explode everything for the easiest one of your life. That's kind of expensive, and maybe kind of keep that in mind. But every spellblade that they also recruit into that pile will further multiply that experience more and more. And if you want to get hyper effective with it, you probably could power level somebody way faster. So, anyways, okay, so just remember with your lobies, it's a good idea to throw any kind of moderate equipment upgrades on them that you can. It's really just that initial starting tier of equipment that's pretty garbage. The rest of this stuff is at least okay. So for example, just by giving her a shield, ring of vigor, a slight robe upgrade, she basically, that would take her out of being one-shot by random goobers territory. Let's say we go over here, and we're going to go ahead and replace the attack team with griffins, just to show how much faster this could potentially be. Let's go ahead and combine it with those. Let's just lower the amount of classes down to, let's say, just those 2. So we'll go ahead and throw the birds all out there to go do as they do. And realistically speaking, we can just go ahead and set them to AI real quick, and they'll be able to get that job done no problem. Because that's one of those nice benefits of throwing birds out here. Actually, that's probably just something worth mentioning in general. So when it comes to your different types of units, remember that something relatively quick definitely can have the advantage in a map like this. So for example, your flying units, especially your birds, well, okay, it depends on the types of flying units, but the birds in particular, like the bird monster units, they have a tendency to be able to double round everything, and in a case like this, they usually will be able to simply multi-round everything on the map before it can reasonably do anything to you, especially due to the fact that they're pretty reasonably separated all over the place. So oftentimes they won't really be there to back each other up. So that's another method that I personally found really useful for training up large groups of units. Just kind of do the bird swarm, as it were, because they might be able to heal 1, doesn't mean they'll be able to heal more than that. You know, they'll throw healing in one place, and then eventually they'll get close to the birds, and then those birds will just swarm on the next guy, and then they'll swarm on the next guy, and petrify, and stun, and poison. They're basically made for this kind of thing, so if you wanted to create a team to just instantly power level your units, just remember that birds exist. Like, you can go into Farampa, the very first map has a bunch of griffins, and them as they are will be enough to beat Tynemouth pretty much every single time. You can change a few things about them, and they'll do the job just fine. If you want to do it with cockatrices, that works too, but the griffins are definitely the easiest thing to get a hold of here, especially if you happen to have a necromancer on your team and you can just make them undead and they'll just immediately come back to life. So as you can see, in this case, they ended up getting 464 as opposed to the 200, like, what was it, like 220 or something that they got the first time. And so you can just keep repeating this over and over. Just kind of turn it on fast forward and let the birds handle it. Because, you know, training is for the birds. But yeah. As far as augments go, as far as skill ranks go, the general rules that you want to follow there, so rank 2 is going to be your first finisher. That's really going to be the most impactful because you have the option of a finisher. Up until then, they can feel a little bit lackluster. Outside of that, really all you need to worry about is just trying to keep everybody roughly at the same level, which if you're running the Class A XP scaling fix, that'll basically handle itself. On top of that, when it comes to levels and such, typically the game ends at around 25-ish, but depending on how much side content you do, that can be very different. Just expect to end around 20 or 25-ish, and then the post-game goes all the way up to 50, depending on how far you want to take that. The only time that you really want to pay attention to leveling whatsoever is actually going to be in late game for Palace of the Dead. And that's actually not because you need high levels to beat it, but instead it's because it actually takes a pretty decently long time to go through there, and experience rates are actually way slower in Palace of the Dead, meaning that you don't have time to go and train. So let's say when you're going through POTD, if you find somebody that's pretty reasonably behind, it can take them a really long time to go and get themselves up, you know? So just kind of something to throw out there. Okay. So that is about that. When it comes to your unique classes, like at this point, she is probably decent enough to just kind of throw into the back of the team, and she'll level up way faster. This initial map is good for getting them into double digits, and then from there you can just kind of upgrade yourself as you go. It'll depend on their on their class as far as what equipment will be potentially better for them. But 10 is an okay safe bet, but you can, for example, put them up to, let's say, you can put them up to like 14 or so, sometimes 16, 18, depending on what kind of whatever you feel comfortable with, you know. So, just kind of throwing that out there. If you, for example, don't want to bother going after birds and cockatrices and whatever else, remember that you can also just make an AI team entirely out of ranged units, and they'll be able to handle this place just fine as well. So yeah, I'm assuming most people are on emulator. This is why I'm going into the whole AI team approach here, because I'd assume, like, this is something that comes up a lot for Reborn and such, where a lot of folks refuse to play it until they could just kind of replace all the training with AI stuff. So here you go. That's how you do that. You either use birds or use ranged units or whatever else. Tynemouth Hill is such an easy map that you could pretty much handle it with just about anything, but it's a lot more consistent with ranged and bird type units. So there's that. All right, so we've covered the different interactions that can happen from your different training methods. We've covered a few ways to potentially train your people up faster. What potentially matters, the fact that the classes and units are separated. And additionally, it's probably worth noting that when it comes to your kind of experience rates, those are going to be different all over the place. When it comes to the importance of your levels, again, remember the game basically ends at 25. If you're going and getting additional levels all over the place arbitrarily, you're just making the game harder for yourself. You're not really going to get too much out of that. Seeing as it will just start scaling up on you. So just know that that's there. Let's see. As far as unlocks go, when the game scales up on you, yes, technically you do get access to new equipment. You could argue that it's kind of Oblivion-esque in that way. And if you were to recruit those units, you would get that equipment. So if you wanted to, let's say, skip getting crafting books or whatever else, technically that is a way to do it. I guess it's relevant. You don't really need to. It's just a potential way for you to maybe save some crafting materials. Alright, whatever else. The only other time that levels might come up is if you're going into the quote-unquote DLC areas, so stuff like the Azilston side quest, where stuff will be a little bit higher, because unfortunately that's one of those areas that's kind of hard-locked to not really scale up that much. It's kind of locked into one particular range rather than having different versions like everywhere else, so that could potentially be a complication for you. For most folks, it's definitely not as much of a complication as it was back in PSP, seeing as it was way more noticeable in that version, because they suddenly came in with a bunch of skills that even the final boss didn't have. Okay. I think we'll just go ahead and leave it there. We've covered most of the important stuff. If there's any questions, if you got any confusion, just go ahead and leave a comment. As you do, I will get to it as soon as I can. And that's about that. Hope this was useful for y'all. Take care, and I will see you when I see you. All right. Take care.